The evening air was cool and calm as people began gathering inside the old town concert hall. The soft lights, the faint echo of laughter, and the smell of polished wood filled the space with warmth. Everyone was excited because that night a world-famous pianist was coming to perform. It was a rare event in that small town, and people had been talking about it for weeks. Seats were filling quickly, and the audience buzzed with anticipation. Among the crowd sat a quiet woman, dressed simply, with her hair tied back and her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had a gentle look, the kind that carried both kindness and fatigue. She wasn't there for attention or luxury. She was there for music. She sat near the back of the hall, almost invisible among the elegant guests. Her clothes were plain, her shoes worn from years of walking to work, and her expression humble. She listened to the chatter around her. People talking about how brilliant the pianist was, how expensive the tickets had been, and how lucky they were to witness a star perform live. She smiled faintly, not out of jealousy, but because she truly loved music. For her, the piano wasn't just sound. It was emotion. It was memory. It was a piece of her life that she had left behind long ago. As the lights dimmed, silence fell over the hall. The grand piano stood on stage, shining under the spotlight. Then the famous pianist walked in with a confident smile and a graceful bow. The applause was thunderous. He was charming, well-dressed, and known around the world for his incredible skill. He had performed in big cities and grand theaters, and now he was here, in this small town, as part of his charity tour. He waved to the crowd and began to play. His fingers danced effortlessly over the keys, filling the hall with beautiful melodies. The audience sat still, mesmerized by the harmony. Every note he played was perfect, every movement practiced and precise. The woman at the back closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. She could feel each note sink deep into her chest. It reminded her of when she used to play years ago, before life became complicated. She once had a piano at home, an old upright model that her father had saved for years to buy. She used to spend hours sitting there, playing songs that made her heart feel light. But time changed things. Responsibilities, family, work. They all piled up until music quietly slipped away from her life. Yet tonight, sitting in that hall, the sound of the piano felt like a forgotten friend whispering her name again. After his last song, the pianist stood and took a bow. The crowd cheered and clapped, calling for more. He smiled and decided to have a bit of fun with the audience. "Who among you plays the piano?" he asked, raising his hand playfully. Some people laughed, others pointed at each other jokingly. He scanned the crowd, and for a brief second his eyes landed on the quiet woman sitting in the back. Something about her stillness caught his attention. He grinned and said, half joking, "You there in the back, would you like to try?" The audience laughed. Everyone thought it was just a harmless tease. The woman looked around, unsure if he was truly speaking to her. When she realized he was, her heart skipped. The lights made it hard to see, but she could feel hundreds of eyes turned toward her. A soft laugh rippled through the crowd, and someone nearby whispered, "She won't go up there." Even the pianist chuckled, waving his hand lightly as if to say he was joking. But to everyone's surprise, the woman slowly stood up. The laughter quieted. She adjusted her simple dress, held her small bag close to her side, and began walking down the aisle, toward the stage. The hall became silent except for the soft sound of her shoes tapping on the wooden floor. The pianist blinked in surprise, not expecting her to take it seriously. He quickly smiled to cover his embarrassment and gestured toward the piano, trying to keep things light. "Come, play a simple tune," he said in a kind but amused tone. The woman nodded politely. Her steps were slow and steady, and though her heart was racing, her face remained calm. The host, standing by the side, whispered something to the pianist, and they both shared a quick, nervous laugh, unsure of what to expect next. When she reached the stage, the woman gave a small bow. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the smooth surface of the grand piano. It was beautiful, glossy, perfect, and far grander than any instrument she had ever played. The pianist stepped aside, still smiling, but there was now a trace of curiosity in his eyes. The audience murmured quietly. Some whispered things like, "This is going to be awkward, and she'll probably just hit a few random keys." Others leaned forward wondering who she was and why she seemed so calm. She sat down slowly, her feet finding the pedals as if they knew where to go by instinct. Her hands hovered above the keys, and for a brief moment she hesitated. She could hear her own heartbeat, quick and loud. She thought about turning back, but something inside her told her to stay. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was longing, or maybe it was that old love for music that never truly died. She took a deep breath. The hall was so quiet that even the faint sound of her breathing could be heard. Then she pressed the first key. The sound was soft but clear, ringing through the hall like a drop of water in still air. A few people giggled quietly, expecting her to stop after a few random notes, but she didn't. Her fingers began to move, slowly at first, then more confidently. The melody that came out wasn't loud or showy. It was gentle, emotional, and full of feeling. Each note connected to the next with care, as though she was telling a story through sound. The audience stopped whispering. The laughter died completely. Even the pianist froze, watching her hands move with unexpected grace. The woman forgot about the crowd. She forgot about the stage and the famous man standing beside her. In her mind, she was back home, sitting at her old piano. She could almost see her father smiling at her from the doorway, could almost hear the sound of rain tapping on the window like it used to. She played not for fame, not for approval, but because she loved it, because it was a part of who she was. The audience sat in complete silence. Some people had tears in their eyes without knowing why. The music carried something real, something that couldn't be explained by skill alone. It had honesty, a warmth that professional perfection sometimes lacked. The pianist, standing a few feet away, began to feel something shift inside him. His expression softened, and he realized this wasn't a joke anymore. This woman, this simple-looking stranger, was playing with a soul that touched everyone listening. When she finished, the final note lingered in the air for a long time before fading away. The woman lifted her hands off the keys and rested them gently on her lap. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, the hall erupted into applause, not polite or forced, but deep, genuine clapping that filled the room. The woman looked surprised, her eyes wide as if she couldn't believe it was for her. She stood up and bowed slightly, her cheeks flushed. The pianist joined in the applause, still looking at her with disbelief and admiration. He approached her and whispered something softly, though no one could hear what he said. She nodded politely and smiled before stepping down from the stage. As she walked back to her seat, people reached out to touch her hand, to thank her, to tell her how beautiful her playing was. The woman simply smiled shyly and whispered, "Thank you." As she sat down again, the pianist returned to the microphone. His voice, which had been confident and proud all evening, now carried a hint of humility. "Sometimes," he said, "music reminds us that true beauty doesn't need fame or name. It just needs a heart." The audience clapped again, louder than before. The woman lowered her eyes, quietly wiping away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. The concert continued, but the energy in the room had changed. People no longer whispered about ticket prices or fame. They talked about the woman in the simple dress who played like she had known the piano her whole life. Some said, "She must have been a professional once." Others thought she was self-taught. No one really knew, but everyone agreed on one thing. What they had just heard was something they would never forget. When the night ended and people began leaving the hall, the woman walked out quietly into the cool night air. The stars were bright and the streets were calm. She held her bag close and smiled to herself. For the first time in years, she felt alive. She didn't care that she had been the subject of a joke. What mattered was that she had played again. She had found a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. Far behind her, the pianist stood by the window of his dressing room, still thinking about her performance. He couldn't shake the sound of her melody from his mind. It wasn't about perfection or fame. It was about truth. And in that moment, he realized that the greatest lessons in art sometimes come from the most unexpected places. The woman walked home slowly that night, her heart full and her spirit light. She didn't know that her small act of courage would soon spread far beyond that little hall. But for now, she didn't need fame or applause. She had her music back, and that was more than enough. The night after the concert, the small town was still buzzing with what had happened. People couldn't stop talking about the simple woman who had surprised everyone. The story spread quickly, from small cafes to busy bus stops, from local schools to old houses. Everyone had their own version of the story to tell. Some said she was a secret professional musician who hid her talent. Others said she was just an ordinary woman who happened to know how to play. Whatever the truth was, the memory of her playing stayed in everyone's heart. The pianist who had invited her to the stage could not stop thinking about her either. After the concert, while he sat alone in his hotel room, the sound of her melody still played in his head. He had performed in front of thousands, received standing ovations in cities across the world. But what he had heard from that woman was different. It wasn't technical perfection that had impressed him. It was something deeper. Her music had soul, the kind of soul he hadn't felt in years. It had honesty and warmth, and it reminded him why he fell in love with music in the first place. Meanwhile, the woman went back to her simple life. The next morning, she woke up before sunrise as she always did. She made herself tea, looked out of her small kitchen window, and watched the quiet street. The memory of standing on that stage came back to her again and again. She smiled to herself, half in disbelief that she had really done it. Her hands still felt warm from touching the piano keys, and the sound of the audience clapping echoed softly in her memory. For a few moments, it felt like a dream. But it wasn't. It had been real. She lived in a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was full of warmth and old memories. On the shelf stood a faded photo of her younger self sitting at a piano, her face full of joy. Next to it was a stack of old music sheets, some torn, some yellow from age. She hadn't touched them in years, but that morning something inside her made her open the drawer and pull them out. She spread them across the table, running her fingers over the notes. They felt like a part of her that had been sleeping for too long. She used to be a piano teacher at a small local school. Her students adored her because she didn't just teach them to play notes. She taught them to feel the music. But life took a different turn when her husband fell sick years ago. She had to stop teaching and work extra hours at a nearby shop to pay for his treatment. When he passed away, she lost not only him, but also the spark that kept her going. The piano became too painful to touch. She covered it with a cloth and told herself she was too busy to play again. But deep down, she missed it every single day. That night at the concert had brought it all back. The feelings, the memories, the passion she had buried for so long. She realized that even though life had taken a lot from her, music was still there waiting patiently. It had never left her. She had just stopped listening to it. Later that day, while she was walking home from the shop, a young girl stopped her on the street. The girl looked shy but excited. "Excuse me," she said. "Were you the one who played the piano last night?" The woman blushed slightly and nodded. The girl's eyes sparkled. "You were amazing. My mom was crying when you played." The woman smiled gently and thanked her. That small moment filled her heart with warmth. It felt strange but wonderful to be recognized not for what she looked like, but for what she could do. Elsewhere, the famous pianist was sitting in a cafe near the hotel, sipping his coffee and reading a local newspaper. The front page had a picture from the concert, him standing beside the woman as she played. The headline read, "Unexpected talent leaves audience in tears." He smiled and shook his head. He hadn't expected any of it. At first, his invitation had been a careless joke, a playful moment to entertain the crowd, but it had turned into something meaningful. For the first time in a long while, he felt humbled. He realized how easily people, including himself, judged others by appearances. He asked the festival organizer if they knew anything about her. The organizer only said she lived in town and had once been a music teacher. That was all he needed to hear. He wanted to find her, not to offer fame or money, but simply to thank her properly. Something about her had touched him deeply, and he wanted to understand her story. That afternoon, he walked through the small streets of the town, stopping by local stores and asking politely if anyone knew where she lived. Some people recognized her description and pointed him toward a quiet street lined with old trees. It took him a while, but he finally found the small apartment building. He hesitated at the door, unsure if it was right to disturb her, but then he remembered the sincerity in her music and decided that honesty deserved honesty. He knocked softly. When the door opened, she looked surprised to see him standing there. She had seen him only from far away at the concert, not expecting that a man of his status would come to her home. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said gently. "I just wanted to thank you for last night." She stepped aside and invited him in, still a little shy but polite. Her apartment was small, but cozy. The walls were decorated with old paintings and photographs, and the faint smell of tea filled the room. On the table lay the same music sheets she had taken out that morning. He noticed them and smiled. "You still play?" he said softly. She looked down and replied, "I used to, not much these days." They talked for a long time. She told him about her years teaching, about how much she loved sharing music with children, and how life had slowly taken her away from it. He listened quietly, not interrupting, his expression thoughtful. He shared his own story too, about how fame had brought him success but also loneliness, how his music had become more about perfection than passion. They both realized that they were two very different people connected by the same love for music. Before leaving, he asked if she would come to the concert hall the next day. "We're having another show," he said. "I'd like you to play again, this time as my guest, not as a joke." She was taken aback. "Oh, I couldn't," she said, shaking her head. "That night was enough. I don't belong on a big stage." But he smiled kindly and said, "You do. You just don't know it yet." That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what he had said. A part of her wanted to say yes, to feel that magic again. But another part was afraid. What if she wasn't good enough anymore? What if people laughed this time? Yet deep down, she remembered the feeling of her fingers moving across the piano, the warmth in her heart, the applause that had felt like sunlight. Maybe, she thought, some chances shouldn't be ignored twice. The next morning, she walked to the concert hall early. The pianist was already there, practicing quietly. When he saw her standing in the doorway, he smiled. "I knew you'd come," he said. She hesitated for a moment, then smiled back. "I thought I'd at least watch," she replied. He gestured toward the piano. "Or maybe play a little." She laughed softly, and it felt good to laugh. It had been a long time since she felt that light. She walked over to the piano and sat down. Her hands trembled again, but this time with excitement, not fear. He sat beside her, and for a moment there was silence between them. The kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. Then, together, they began to play. The sound filled the empty hall, wrapping around the seats and echoing softly off the walls. Their styles were different. His was precise and elegant. Hers was emotional and tender. But together, they blended perfectly. When they stopped, he looked at her and said quietly, "You have a gift. Don't hide it anymore." Tears filled her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "Thank you," she whispered, "for reminding me who I was." He shook his head gently. "No," he said, "you reminded me who I was." Later that evening, as she walked home under the orange glow of the setting sun, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the kind that comes from dreams or luck, but the quiet kind that comes from rediscovering yourself. She realized that maybe life had taken her far from her music, but it had never truly taken the music out of her. It had just been waiting for the right moment to return. And so, as she passed by a small music shop on her way home, she stopped. In the window stood a second-hand piano, old but beautiful. She walked in and asked the owner if she could play it for a minute. He nodded. She sat down, pressed a few keys, and felt the familiar comfort of the sound. When she finished, the owner smiled and said, "You play like someone who's been waiting to play for a long time." She smiled back, her eyes glistening slightly. "Maybe I have," she said quietly. And as she walked out of the shop, she knew this was only the beginning of something new. Not fame, not fortune, but a return to the thing she loved most. A part of herself she had finally found again. The day of the second concert arrived quietly, yet the whole town seemed to hum with a new kind of excitement. People were still talking about what had happened a few nights earlier, the moment when a simple woman unknown to everyone had walked up to the stage and played the piano with such deep emotion that the entire hall had fallen silent. It was a story that people couldn't stop telling. Some said it was fate, some said it was a miracle, and some believed it was a reminder that talent can live quietly in ordinary lives. That morning, she woke up earlier than usual. The air was cool and light from the window painted soft shapes on the floor. For a while, she just sat by the window with her cup of tea, staring at the street below. People were heading to work, children running to school, cars passing slowly. It was a simple morning, yet something inside her felt different. There was a quiet stirring in her heart, a feeling she hadn't known for a long time, something between nervousness and joy. She had promised herself that she wouldn't go back to the concert hall, but when she remembered how her fingers had felt on those piano keys and how her heart had raced when the crowd applauded, she couldn't push the memory away. Music had found her again. It was like meeting an old friend she thought she had lost forever. Later in the day, she stood in front of the small mirror beside her bed. She wore the same simple dress she had worn that first night, but this time she tied her hair differently and smiled at her reflection. There was still a trace of nervousness in her eyes, but behind it was something stronger. Quiet confidence. She wasn't going to play for fame or attention. She just wanted to play because it made her feel alive. When she reached the concert hall, it was nearly empty. The rehearsal had not started yet. The pianist was already there, seated near the stage, adjusting some music sheets. When he saw her enter, his face lit up with a warm smile. "I was hoping you'd come," he said softly. She smiled back, a little shy but grateful. He gestured toward the piano. "Would you like to practice a bit?" he asked. She nodded slowly, walked to the grand piano and sat down. For a few seconds, she just looked at it, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. It was the same piano she had played before, the one that had changed everything. The hall was silent, but she could almost hear the echoes of her own music from that night. She began to play softly, testing the notes, feeling her way through the melody. The pianist watched her closely, amazed at the natural emotion in her playing. Every movement of her hands carried grace, even though she hadn't practiced for years. There was something about her that didn't come from training alone. It came from life, from experience, from love, from pain. Her music wasn't about perfection, it was about truth. When she finished, he clapped quietly and said, "You have a gift that touches people. You don't play with your fingers. You play with your heart." She laughed softly and said, "Maybe because my heart has been through a lot." As they talked, the hall staff began to prepare for the evening show. Sound technicians tested the microphones, assistants arranged flowers near the stage, and a few musicians entered for the orchestra rehearsal. The pianist explained that tonight's performance would include a special duet, the two of them, playing together. The idea made her nervous. "I don't want to embarrass you," she said, half-jokingly, but he shook his head. "You could never embarrass me. You remind me what real music feels like." As the afternoon passed, the seats began to fill with people. Word had spread quickly, and many had come not just for the famous pianist, but to see the mysterious woman who had played that unforgettable melody days ago. Some didn't believe the story was true and wanted to see it with their own eyes. Others simply wanted to feel that same emotion again. Backstage, she could hear the soft murmur of the audience through the curtains. Her hands were shaking slightly. The pianist noticed and said quietly, "Don't think about them. Just think about the piano, it's just you and the music." She nodded, took a deep breath, and looked down at her hands. She remembered how years ago she used to tell her students the same thing. Music, she would say, doesn't live in the notes. It lives in the space between them, in the feeling you carry when you play. When the lights dimmed and the applause began, she felt her heart thump hard against her chest. The pianist walked on stage first, greeted the audience, and smiled warmly. "Tonight," he said into the microphone, "I would like to share something special. Last week I met someone who reminded me why music exists. She didn't come from fame or luxury. She came with simplicity and honesty, and she played something that touched all of us. Please welcome her." The hall filled with applause as she stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, and for a moment she felt frozen. But when she looked at the piano, the fear faded. She walked slowly to it, sat down, and took a deep breath. The pianist nodded at her, and together they began to play. The music started softly, a slow, flowing duet that told a story without words. His playing was smooth and perfect, like water gliding over stones. Hers was gentle and emotional, like a voice full of memory. Together their sounds blended beautifully. The audience watched in awe as the two pianos seemed to speak to each other, one precise, one tender, but both deeply connected. As the piece continued, the woman lost herself in the rhythm. Every note brought back something she had forgotten: her childhood lessons, the evenings she spent playing for her husband, the joy of hearing students learn their first song. Her eyes glistened as she played, and the pianist noticed, moved himself. When the final note echoed through the hall, the room went completely silent. Then slowly the applause began. Soft at first, then louder and louder until it filled the entire hall. People stood up, clapping and cheering. Some even wiped their eyes. The pianist looked at her, smiling with respect. "You were perfect," he whispered. She shook her head. "No, I just played what I felt." He nodded. "That's what perfection really means." After the performance, they both walked backstage, where several people came to congratulate them. Some reporters tried to ask her questions, but she quietly slipped away. Fame wasn't what she wanted. All she wanted was the feeling she had when she played, the peace and freedom that music brought her. Later that night, the pianist found her sitting outside near the steps of the hall, looking up at the stars. She smiled when he joined her. "It feels strange," she said softly. "All those people, all that applause, it doesn't feel real." He looked at her for a moment and said, "It's real because you earned it. You gave them something they didn't expect. Something they needed." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint sounds of the city. Then he asked, "Do you ever think about teaching again?" Her face softened. "Every day," she said. "But I thought no one would want to learn from me anymore." He shook his head. "You're wrong. People need teachers like you, ones who understand music beyond the surface." His words stayed with her long after he left that night. She walked home slowly, feeling lighter than she had in years. When she entered her apartment, she looked at the old photo of herself sitting at a piano as a young woman. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel sad when she saw it. She felt proud. The next morning, she visited the local school where she used to teach. The building hadn't changed much. Same worn-out steps, same echoing halls. She met the principal, who was surprised but happy to see her. "It's been years," he said warmly. She told him she wanted to start teaching again, even part-time, maybe a small class or two. He smiled and said, "We'd be lucky to have you back." A few weeks later, she stood in a classroom with a few children sitting in front of small keyboards. They looked at her with curiosity and excitement. She smiled gently and said, "Music is like a story. You don't have to be rich or famous to tell it. You just have to mean it." The children listened quietly, and when she started to play, a short tune, their faces lit up with wonder. She saw herself in their eyes, the same spark she once had. In the evenings, she continued to visit the concert hall, sometimes to help the pianist during rehearsals, sometimes just to listen. They became friends, sharing long talks about life and art. He often told people that she was the reason he had fallen back in love with music. She reminded me, he would say, that perfection without heart is empty. As weeks passed, people in town began calling her the Heart Pianist. The name started spreading beyond the town too, through videos and small interviews. Yet, she didn't seek attention. She continued her quiet life, teaching children and playing whenever she could. She never forgot the moment when everything changed, when she walked up to that stage not to prove anything, but simply to be herself. And whenever she sat at a piano, she would close her eyes and remember that night, the laughter, the silence, the music, and the way the crowd had listened like they were hearing the truth for the first time, because that's what it had been. Not a performance, not a show, but a moment of truth born from the heart of a simple woman who loved music more than anything else. When the last note faded into silence, the entire hall stood still. The woman slowly lifted her fingers from the piano keys, and for a long moment no one moved or made a sound. It was as if the air itself didn't want to break the magic that had just filled the room. The pianist, who had been standing nearby, looked, frozen in disbelief. The playful grin that had once been on his face was gone. His eyes were wide, as if he had just seen something beyond words. Then, out of nowhere, someone in the back of the hall began to clap. The sound was soft at first, hesitant. But then, it spread through the crowd until the whole room was echoing with applause. People were cheering, whistling, and shouting words of praise. Some even had tears running down their faces, wiping them quietly while smiling through their emotions. The woman stood up, a little shy, her face flushed with surprise. She looked like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the right words. The pianist stepped forward and gently touched her arm, guiding her toward the front of the stage. The lights above them felt brighter now, but her expression was humble, even nervous. When the applause finally calmed down, the pianist raised the microphone and said, almost whispering, Who are you?" The woman gave a soft smile and shook her head slightly as if embarrassed by all the attention. "I'm nobody," she said in a quiet voice. "Just someone who used to play a long time ago." Her words made people lean forward, curious. The pianist looked confused. He asked again, "Used to play? You mean you're not a professional musician?" She smiled faintly and said, "No, I'm not. I used to teach children music when I was younger, but that was many years ago." Her voice trembled a little, and she looked down, almost as if she was afraid of saying too much. The pianist, still holding the microphone, seemed lost for a moment. He didn't know what to say. Everyone in the audience had expected some grand story, maybe that she was secretly famous or had trained at some great music school. But her answer was simple, and yet it felt more powerful than anything else could have been. After a short pause, someone in the crowd shouted, "That was beautiful," and another person added, "You played with your heart." The woman smiled, softly, but said nothing. The pianist finally found his voice again and said, "You played like someone who has lived music, not just learned it. It felt real." She nodded slightly and said, "Music was once everything to me. But sometimes life takes you in another direction, and before you know it, you stop doing the things that once made you happy." The audience fell silent again, listening carefully. Her words sounded simple, but there was pain hidden in them. The pianist hesitated for a moment, then asked gently, "If you don't mind me asking, why did you stop?" The woman looked down at her hands and took a deep breath before answering. "I had to take care of my family," she said softly. "My husband got sick and I had 2 children to look after. There wasn't time for lessons, concerts, or even a piano of my own. I sold my old one to pay for his treatment. I never thought I would play again." Her voice trembled slightly and you could see her holding back tears. The pianist lowered his microphone and placed a hand on her shoulder in a quiet gesture of respect. The audience could feel the weight of her story. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about love, sacrifice, and how easily dreams could fade when life became hard. The woman smiled again, but this time her eyes glistened. "I came here tonight just to listen," she said. "I never imagined I would end up playing." The pianist turned to the audience and said in a soft but firm voice, "And yet you gave us the most beautiful moment of the evening." The crowd agreed instantly, cheering and clapping again. People were shouting words of encouragement, telling her not to stop playing ever again. A few people near the front row even tried to hand her flowers they had brought for the pianist. She looked overwhelmed by the kindness around her. As the excitement continued, the pianist asked her to stay on stage a little longer. He then spoke to the crowd again. "Sometimes we think talent belongs only to those who are famous, but tonight, we all learned that true music comes from the heart." And this woman reminded us of that. His words drew another round of applause, and many people nodded with emotion. The woman's hands were shaking slightly as she looked around the hall. She seemed both happy and shy, unsure how to handle so much attention. She whispered a quiet thank you into the microphone, her voice trembling. Then she turned toward the pianist and said softly, "I only played what I felt." He smiled warmly and replied, "And that's exactly what made it unforgettable." Later, when the event ended, many people came forward to meet her. Some told her how her music made them remember their own childhood dreams, while others said her story gave them hope. She listened politely to everyone, smiling and thanking them, though she still seemed unsure how to respond to all the admiration. Backstage, the pianist invited her to sit for a moment and have some water. They sat together quietly for a while, neither saying much. Finally, he asked, "What piece was that you played? It sounded familiar, but somehow different." She smiled faintly and said, "It's a melody I used to teach my students. Over the years, I changed it little by little. It's not written anywhere. It's just something that stayed with me." The pianist looked amazed. "So it's your own composition?" She nodded, almost shyly. "I suppose it is. I never thought much about it. It was just something I played when I missed my old piano." He leaned back, thinking deeply. "You know, I've played in concert halls all over the world, but I don't think I've ever felt something quite like that. You made everyone stop and feel something real." She looked at him with kind eyes and said, "That's what music is supposed to do, isn't it?" He nodded slowly, realizing how simple and yet profound her words were. A few journalists who were covering the concert had overheard the conversation. One of them quietly took a few pictures, capturing the moment without interrupting. The pianist didn't mind. He wanted her story to be known, not for fame, but because he felt it carried an important lesson. As the woman prepared to leave, the pianist stood and offered to walk her to the door. Outside, the cool night air greeted them. The streets were still lively with people talking about what they had just witnessed. Some even approached her again, asking for autographs or pictures. She laughed gently, saying, "I'm not anyone special," but they insisted, saying, "You are now." The pianist smiled at the scene and said quietly to her, "I think tonight changed something for all of us. It certainly changed something in me." She looked at him curiously and asked, "How so?" He paused for a moment and replied, "I came here thinking I was the star of the evening, but you reminded me that art isn't about showing off. It's about sharing something honest. I had forgotten that for a while." She looked touched by his honesty and said softly, "We all forget sometimes." They stood there for a few moments, the lights of the hall glowing behind them, people still talking and laughing around. The woman turned to go, holding her small purse close to her chest. Before she left, the pianist said, "I hope this won't be the last time you play." She smiled and said, "Maybe not. Maybe tonight was the start of something again." And then she walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving the pianist standing under the soft glow of the streetlight. Inside the hall, people were still talking about her performance. Some said they had never felt so moved by music before. Others said it reminded them that greatness doesn't always come with fame. The event organizers were surprised at how something so unplanned had become the highlight of the evening. That night, the pianist couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about her, the way she played, the story she told, the humility in her voice. He replayed her melody in his mind again and again. It wasn't perfect in a technical sense, but it had a warmth and sincerity that he couldn't stop thinking about. For the first time in a long while, he felt inspired, not by success or applause, but by something simple and pure. Meanwhile, the woman returned home quietly. Her small apartment was dimly lit, the walls lined with old photographs and memories. She sat on her couch, took off her shoes, and sighed softly. She thought about what had happened, how a simple joke turned into a moment she would never forget. She smiled to herself and whispered, "Maybe it was meant to happen." Then she looked at her hands, the same hands that hadn't touched a real piano in years, and felt tears fill her eyes. Not of sadness, but of joy and relief. She made a silent promise to herself that night. She would find a way to play again, even if it was just for a few minutes a day, even if it was on an old keyboard or a borrowed piano. She realized that the music she thought she had lost had never really left her. It had just been waiting for the right moment to return. Far away, the pianist was sitting by his hotel window, watching the city lights. He took out his phone and opened a blank note. At the top, he typed the words, "The woman at the piano." He didn't know yet what he would write, maybe a song, maybe a letter, but he knew one thing for sure. That night had changed him. And as he looked out at the quiet streets, he smiled faintly and whispered, "Thank you." Neither of them knew then that what had happened that night would soon spread far beyond that small town. But in their hearts, they both carried the same quiet truth, that sometimes even a simple melody can change everything. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the windows of the hotel room where the pianist sat with his cup of coffee, still thinking about what had happened the night before. He had played countless concerts in grand halls and traveled to many countries, but something about that evening wouldn't leave his mind. The sound of the woman's melody lingered in his thoughts like a quiet echo. It wasn't only the beauty of her music that stayed with him, but the humility and truth behind it. He felt both inspired and ashamed, inspired by her raw talent, and ashamed of his own arrogance. He had joked with her, not realizing that the person he was teasing carried a soul full of music that could move hearts more deeply than any polished performance. He sat by the piano in the hotel's lounge later, that morning, pressing a few keys absent-mindedly. Each note reminded him of her. The manager came over to greet him and mentioned that many people were still talking about the unexpected moment during the concert. "Everyone's calling it the highlight of the evening," the manager said with a smile. "The woman's performance is all over social media now. Someone recorded it." The pianist looked up, surprised. "Recorded it?" he asked. "Yes," the manager replied. "It's spreading fast. People say they were touched by how pure and emotional it was." The pianist sat in silence for a while after that. He wasn't sure how he felt. Proud that something beautiful had happened at his concert, or embarrassed that his own ego had started it as a joke. He looked down at his hands and sighed. "She taught me more in 5 minutes than I've learned in years," he whispered to himself. Meanwhile, the woman had gone back to her normal life that morning. Her little apartment felt the same, but inside her heart something was different. She woke up feeling lighter, almost as if a part of her that had been asleep for years had finally woken up again. She made herself tea, sat by the window, and thought about what happened the night before. The cheering, the applause, the way the pianist had looked at her. All of it felt like a dream. She smiled softly, thinking maybe it really was just luck, or maybe life had wanted to remind her of something she had forgotten. When she went to the market later that day, people she had never spoken to before came up to her. Some had seen the concert in person, and others had already watched the video online. "You were amazing last night," one woman said. "I cried while listening to you," another man added. "It's been years since I felt something like that from music." She felt shy but thanked them kindly, her face warm with embarrassment. She didn't know the video had reached so many people already. By the afternoon, her phone started buzzing nonstop. A local news channel wanted to talk to her. Music students were sending her messages, saying how her story gave them courage. Even her old students from years ago, the ones she had taught when she was younger, began reaching out. "We saw you play, teacher. We're so proud of you," one message read. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read their words. She hadn't heard from many of them in years, but now they were all remembering her. That evening, the famous pianist called the concert organizer and asked for her contact information. He wanted to speak with her personally. He wasn't sure what he would say, but he knew he needed to tell her how much her music had touched him. When he finally got her number, he hesitated before dialing, feeling strangely nervous. When she answered, her voice was gentle and a bit surprised. "Hello?" she said softly. He took a deep breath and said, "It's me. From last night." There was a pause before she replied, "Oh, yes. Hello." Her tone was polite but calm. He said, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just wanted to thank you again. What you did last night. It reminded me of why I started playing in the first place." She didn't say anything for a moment, then replied quietly, "That's kind of you to say. I didn't mean to make such a scene. I only played because you asked." He laughed softly. "I know. And I'm sorry about that. I made a mistake by asking you as a joke. I thought it would just be a bit of fun. I never expected you to sit down and create something so powerful." Her voice softened. "It's all right," she said. "Maybe it was meant to happen that way. If you hadn't asked, I probably would never have touched a piano again." They both fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Then the pianist said, "I was wondering, would you consider joining me for a small performance tomorrow? Nothing big, just a short duet at the end of my next concert. I think people would love to hear us play together." She hesitated. "Oh, I don't know. I'm not a performer anymore. I haven't played on stage for years before last night." He said softly, "You don't have to be a performer. You just have to be yourself. That's what people loved." After a long pause, she sighed and said, "I'll think about it." The next day passed quickly. Her story had already spread far and wide. Local papers ran headlines like, "Ordinary Woman Moves Audience to Tears at Concert," and "The Unknown Pianist Who Stole the Show." Everywhere she went, people recognized her. She wasn't used to attention, and it made her both happy and uncomfortable. She told herself that fame didn't matter. What mattered was that she had found her music again. That evening, as she sat at her small table with an old keyboard she had borrowed from a neighbor, she practiced the melody she had played at the concert. Her fingers were still steady, and her heart felt alive again. She didn't realize that the pianist had already made an announcement about her joining his concert that night. When she finally checked her phone later, she saw a message from him. "The audience is waiting for us. Come if you can." She stood there, unsure of what to do. Her first thought was to say no. It was too soon, too public, too frightening. But then she remembered how she felt when she played last time. She remembered the warmth, the connection, the feeling of being alive again. And so she got dressed, took a deep breath, and walked out the door. When she arrived at the concert hall, the pianist greeted her with a kind smile. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. She smiled back nervously and replied, "I almost didn't." He guided her backstage, and together they decided what to play. Her melody, blended with one of his own. "Let's make it simple," he said. "No rehearsals. Just feel it." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly, but inside she felt calm, as if her heart already knew what to do. When they stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. Everyone recognized her immediately. The pianist waited for the noise to quiet down, then spoke into the microphone. "Last night, something beautiful happened here. It reminded me that music is not about perfection. It's about truth. Tonight, I have the honor to play alongside someone who reminded me of that truth." He gestured toward her, and the audience clapped even louder. She smiled shyly and took her seat at the piano. The first few notes echoed softly through the hall. The Saig duet began gently, her simple melody weaving with his elegant style. At first she was nervous, but as the music flowed, she forgot about everything. The crowd, The lights, the cameras. She just played. Their hands moved in harmony, one complementing the other. The sound was both new and familiar, tender yet powerful. The audience sat in total silence, not wanting to miss a single note. By the time the last chord faded away, the hall was filled with emotion again. The audience rose to their feet, applauding loudly, some even crying. The pianist looked at her with gratitude, and she smiled back, knowing this moment would stay with her forever. He leaned over and whispered, "Thank you for saying yes." She whispered back, "Thank you for asking." After the concert, reporters rushed backstage. They wanted interviews, photos, anything they could get. The pianist answered most of the questions, making sure the focus stayed on her. "She reminded me," he told them, "that music isn't about fame or perfection. It's about sharing something real. I'm just glad I was there to witness it." That night, as they walked out of the concert hall together, the street outside was lined with people waiting to see her. Some had flowers, others just wanted to shake her hand. She looked overwhelmed but happy. The pianist noticed tears forming in her eyes again and said softly, "You deserve this." She shook her head. "I don't know if I do," she replied. "I didn't plan any of this, I just played." He smiled and said, "That's exactly why it's so special." When she finally got home later that night, she sat quietly in the dark for a long time. Her phone kept buzzing with messages, but she didn't check them. Instead, she looked at her hands again, the same hands that had once given up on music, and whispered softly, "Thank you." She didn't even know who she was thanking. Maybe fate, maybe the music itself. Meanwhile, the pianist sat in his hotel room again, replaying their duet in his mind. He felt at peace, something he hadn't felt in years. He realized that fame, awards, and applause had never made him feel this way. It was the honesty of that woman's music that brought him back to why he had started playing as a child. Not to impress anyone, but to feel something real. He knew he would never forget her, or the way she had changed his heart without even trying. And so, that night ended not with grand speeches or big promises, but with a quiet understanding between two people who had shared something pure. One had found her way back to her lost dream, and the other had rediscovered the soul of his art. In that simple, wordless connection, both of their lives began to change in ways neither of them could yet imagine. A few days had passed since the concert, yet the story of the simple woman and the famous pianist had spread far beyond the little town. People from all over were talking about it. The video of their duet had gone viral, shared millions of times. Comments poured in from every corner of the world. Some said her music made them cry, others said it gave them hope, and many said it reminded them to never give up on their dreams. The pianist's name was, of course, already known, but now people were speaking more about her, the woman who played from her heart and touched souls without fame or fortune. She didn't expect any of this. Her quiet life had suddenly become filled with messages, interviews, and invitations. Music schools wanted her to visit and speak to students. A few local news outlets came to her small apartment, filming her simple life and asking her about her journey. She sat there humbly, answering softly, her voice calm and kind. "I'm not special," she kept saying. "I just played what I felt." But her eyes always glowed when she spoke about music, and that glow spoke louder than words. Meanwhile, the pianist had returned to his tour, but something inside him had changed completely. Every night before his concerts, he thought about her. He no longer rushed through his performances or focused on showing off his technique. Instead, he tried to play with feeling, letting every note breathe. During interviews, people kept asking him about the woman. He smiled each time and said, "She reminded me what music truly is, not perfection, but emotion." His fans admired him for his honesty, and even those who had once criticized him for being too proud saw a new side of him. One morning, he received a letter at his hotel. The handwriting was neat and gentle. It was from her. She thanked him for everything, for believing in her, for giving her a chance to play again, and for reminding her that it wasn't too late to follow her passion. The letter ended with one simple line that stayed with him. Music found me again through kindness. I will keep playing, even if it's only for a few children in my town. That line moved him deeply. He decided to visit her again, not as a celebrity, but as a friend. A few weeks later, he quietly returned to the same small town without any media or announcement. He found her teaching a group of children in a small community center. The piano was old and a little out of tune, but her students were laughing, and she looked happier than ever. When he walked in, she looked up in surprise and smiled. "You came back," she said softly. He nodded. "I wanted to see what you've been doing." The children whispered among themselves, realizing who he was. But he waved it off and sat in the corner, listening quietly. She was teaching them a simple tune, guiding their fingers gently over the keys. "Don't worry about mistakes," she told them. "Music isn't about being perfect. It's about telling a story." The pianist smiled as he watched. Those words sounded exactly like what he had needed to hear years ago. When the lesson ended, she came over and offered him a cup of tea. They sat together at the small table by the window. The afternoon sun poured through the glass, lighting up the dust particles in the air like tiny golden stars. "You've built something beautiful here," he said. She smiled and replied, "It's small, but it's honest. These kids remind me why I started teaching in the first place." He looked around the little room. There were posters of musical notes on the walls, and a few drawings made by children were taped up beside the piano. "They love you," he said quietly. She laughed softly. "They love music. I just help them find it." After a long pause, the pianist said, "I've been thinking. I want to start a foundation to help people like you, those who once had to give up music because of life's struggles. Maybe we can give them instruments, lessons, or even a stage to play on again." She looked at him with wide eyes, touched by the idea. "That's a beautiful thing," she said. "People forget how many dreams get lost when life becomes hard." He nodded. "Maybe we can help bring some of them back." And so they started working on it together. They didn't announce it grandly. It began quietly, with just a few letters, a few calls, a few people willing to help. Over time, it grew. Musicians from different countries offered donations, music stores provided instruments, and schools opened their doors. They named the program Second Melody, a simple name that carried a deep meaning, that it's never too late to start again. Months passed, and their work brought joy to many people. In one town, a retired man who had once been a violinist picked up his bow again after 30 years. In another, a teenage girl who couldn't afford piano lessons got to learn for free. Everywhere, people were rediscovering the music they thought they had lost forever. Through it all, the woman stayed humble. She still lived in her same little apartment, still taught her group of children, and still smiled when people called her the heart pianist. Fame never changed her because she never wanted it. For her, the greatest joy was seeing others play and feel the same happiness she felt that night on stage. The pianist, on the other hand, found a new peace in his own career. He still performed around the world, but his concerts now had a different energy. Between songs, he often shared stories, not about himself, but about people like her. Audiences listened with respect, and many said his music now felt warmer and more human. He no longer sought applause. He sought connection. One evening, about a year after their first meeting, he invited her to one of his big concerts in a major city. He didn't tell her why, just sent her a ticket and a simple note. "Please come. There's something I want to share." She hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted to step back into the spotlight, but eventually, she decided to go. The concert hall was grand, filled with thousands of people. She sat quietly in the audience, hidden among the crowd, watching him play. His performance that night was unlike any other. Every note was soft, emotional, and pure. When he finished his final piece, he took the microphone and said, "Before I go, I want to share something special. A year ago, I met someone who changed the way I see music. Someone who reminded me that talent can live in the quietest corners of the world." The audience murmured curiously. Then the spotlight turned toward her seat. She froze for a moment, realizing what was happening. The pianist smiled and said, "Would you please join me once more?" The crowd began clapping, and though she felt shy, something inside her told her to go. She walked slowly toward the stage, her hands trembling slightly but her heart calm. When she reached the piano, the pianist whispered, "This time, you start." She nodded, took a deep breath, and began to play her old melody, the same one she had played that very first night. The audience fell completely silent. Then, after a few bars, the pianist joined in, and their music blended beautifully, like two old friends finishing each other's sentences. The sound filled the hall, warm and gentle, wrapping around everyone like a soft embrace. When the last note faded, the hall erupted into thunderous applause. People stood up, clapping and cheering. Some had tears in their eyes, just like before. The woman smiled and looked at the pianist, who bowed to her instead of the crowd. It was his way of showing respect, of saying that she was the true heart behind it all. After the concert, they sat together backstage once more, just like that first time. The room was quiet except for the faint noise of people leaving the hall. "You did it again," he said softly. She laughed, shaking her head. "No," she said. "We did it." He looked thoughtful and said, "It's strange, isn't it, how a small moment can change everything?" She nodded slowly. "Maybe it's not strange," she replied. "Maybe that's how life works. One small thing opens a door you didn't even know was there." They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts. Finally, she said, "You know, before that night I used to think my story was over. I thought I had already lived the best parts of my life. But now I see that sometimes life gives you another beginning when you least expect it." He smiled warmly and said, "And sometimes you need someone to remind you of it." She looked at him and said, "We reminded each other." That was the truth. In a world full of noise and competition, they had both found something simple and pure. Connection through music, through kindness, through shared humanity. Years later, their story continued to inspire people everywhere. The second melody, Foundation, grew larger, helping thousands of people rediscover their passion for music. But for both of them, it was never about the fame or the success. It was about those quiet, honest moments when a melody could touch a heart, heal a wound, or bring back a forgotten dream. And whenever the pianist spoke about his journey, he always ended his story the same way. Once, he would say with a gentle smile, "I asked a simple woman to play the piano as a joke, but she was the one who taught me what true music really is." Somewhere far from the spotlight and the noise, she still played on an old piano in her small room. Her students would gather around, listening with wide eyes and smiling faces. She would tell them, "Never stop playing, even if no one listens. Music is meant to be felt, not just heard." And when she played, it wasn't for applause or recognition. It was for the love of it, the same love that had brought her back to where she truly belonged. In the quiet notes of her piano, in the hearts of those who heard her story, her music lived on, soft, honest, and eternal.